It started with a text that read, "You up for a drink? Got some whiskey with your name on it." Now, I'm not usually the kind of guy who says yes to random late-night invitations, especially from someone I just met that week. But when the text came from Cade, I didn't even think twice. I threw on a hoodie and headed out the door. Cade was a ranch hand type, the kind of man who could fix a fence with one hand and roll a cigarette with the other. Tall, built like a linebacker, with a drawl slower than molasses and a look in his eye that made everything sound like it had a double meaning. I'd only been in town for 3 weeks, renting a short-term place while I picked up freelance work from a construction company that needed design help. Cade was their go-to guy for repairs. That's how we met. Me in the corner of the hardware store, trying to figure out drill bits, him laughing softly behind me as he handed me the right one. "You're gonna hurt yourself with that," he'd said. "City hands." I laughed, but I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. He offered to help me pick out the rest of what I needed, and then walked me to my truck like we were old friends. We didn't even exchange numbers that day. Just a nod and a "see you around." And then, 3 days later, his text. His place was about 10 minutes out of town, down a gravel road that didn't even have a street light. I half expected to hear banjos, but instead, I saw porch lights glowing softly through the trees. When I pulled up, he was already outside, leaning against the railing with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. "You came," he said. Just like that, calm, certain. "You asked," I shrugged, stepping onto the porch, "and I don't say no to free whiskey." He smirked and handed me a glass. "Come on in." The inside of the house was what you'd expect. Worn-in leather couch, boots by the door, walls that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. A dog barked once from the kitchen and then trotted over, a lazy brown mutt who gave me a sniff and then plopped down like we were cool. Cade poured us each a drink and gestured toward the back patio. "Cooler out here, and the stars are out tonight." We sat side by side, nursing our drinks. He asked about my work, and I told him enough to sound interesting without getting into the boring graphic design details. He talked about the ranch, how it had been in his family for generations, how he ran most of it solo now. There were a few silences, but none of them felt awkward. I caught myself watching the way his jaw tightened when he drank, how his fingers tapped against the glass. He wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something quietly intense about him. The kind of guy who says exactly what he means and nothing more. "You always this quiet?" he asked after a while. I smiled. "Only when I'm trying to figure someone out." "And what have you figured out about me so far?" "That you're either really bad at making friends or really good at choosing them." He laughed at that, this low, genuine sound that made something in my chest tighten. "Fair enough," he said. There was a pause. Then he looked at me and said, "I don't usually do this." "Do what?" "Invite people out here. Guys like you." He took another sip and then added, "Guys I'm not supposed to be thinking about." That pulled the breath right out of my lungs. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't sure if I'd even heard him right. But then he turned toward me, and the look in his eyes made everything crystal clear. This wasn't just some friendly drink. "Look," he said, setting his glass down. "If I'm reading this wrong, tell me now. I won't make it weird." I didn't say anything. Instead, I leaned forward, and for a second, I felt his breath catch. Then he closed the space between us. And just like that, the line between curiosity and something real disappeared. His lips tasted like whiskey and wind. Rough, warm, and real. Not some fantasy I'd cooked up out of loneliness or small-town boredom. Cade was right there, kissing me back like he meant it, like he'd been waiting for this just as much as I had. When we finally pulled apart, there was this second where neither of us spoke. Just the sound of crickets outside and the creak of the porch swing behind us. His eyes searched mine, cautious but unafraid. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "Are you?" Cade nodded once. "Yeah. Just wasn't sure if you'd want that." I gave him a small smile. "I've been wanting that since the hardware store." That made him laugh, that low, chesty sound that made me want to kiss him again. But instead he stood up, picked up the bottle, and motioned with his head. "Come on." "Where are we going?" He just smirked. "Somewhere quieter." I followed him down the steps, past the fence, through the tall grass and into the dark. The night was warm, but the way he moved made me forget about the heat and the bugs and the fact that I was technically walking into a barn with a guy the first barely knew. But it didn't feel dangerous. It felt deliberate, like something we both needed to see through. The barn was old, but clean. Swept floors, tools hung neatly along one wall, and a faint scent of hay and sawdust in the air. Cade flipped on a single hanging bulb, which cast a soft glow over everything. He walked to the center, set the bottle on a workbench, and turned to face me. "I used to come out here just to think," he said, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck. "Figured I'd end up here tonight too. Wasn't expecting you to say yes." I stepped closer. "You thought I wouldn't come?" He gave me a small, almost embarrassed shrug. "You're not like the guys around here." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean gay?" He looked up at me, honest, raw. "I mean, honest about it." I let that hang in the air for a second, then said, "I didn't always used to be." We stood there for a moment, just breathing. There was something heavy between us. Not tension exactly, but a quiet charge, like something important was about to happen, and neither of us wanted to rush it. Then Cade stepped forward again, close enough that I could smell the heat on his skin, the smoke on his breath. He raised a hand, brushed his thumb against my cheek, and said, "I've thought about this more than I care to admit." "You mean this?" I asked, leaning into his touch. He nodded. "Yeah, you, me. Just not pretending." So I kissed him again, and this time it wasn't cautious. It was messy, raw. His hands on my waist, my fingers gripping the back of his neck, mouths moving like we didn't have time to waste. We stumbled back toward the hayloft ladder, laughing between kisses, until he pressed me up against the wooden wall, his body flush against mine. There was nothing graceful about it, and that's what made it real. The scrape of stubble, the way our hips fit, the weight of his hands on my hips. Nothing about Cade felt uncertain anymore. He moved with purpose, with hunger, but there was this tenderness to him too, like he was making sure I knew he wasn't just doing this because he was drunk or lonely. He wanted me. Not just tonight. Not just here. "You sure?" he asked again, his voice low, husky. "Cade," I said, threading my fingers through his belt loops. "If I wasn't sure, I wouldn't be here." His eyes darkened, and he leaned in again. And everything after that, his breath, his touch, the way the night swallowed us whole, was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. After that, everything blurred. Time didn't really exist in that barn. The light swinging overhead cast soft shadows across Cade's bare chest, and the scent of hay mixed with the musk of sweat and wood smoke. I don't know how long we were like that, touching, kissing, wrapped up in each other, but it felt like the world had narrowed to just that space. Just him and me. At one point he laughed, this breathless, almost boyish laugh, when I tugged him down onto a stack of old horse blankets in the corner. His hair was a mess, his jeans half undone, and for the first time that night he looked nervous again. "You ever done this before?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not with a guy, not like this." I nodded. "You want to stop?" He didn't answer with words, he just pulled me closer. It wasn't about rushing into something physical. It was about being seen, completely, and I don't think Cade had ever let anyone see him like that. Not his friends, not his neighbors, probably not even himself. He kissed like he was still figuring it out, still testing boundaries, but there was no hesitation in his hands. They gripped, explored, learned every part of me they could reach. And when our clothes were scattered across the floor and he laid back with a soft groan, eyes half-lidded and mouth parted, I felt this rush. Not just desire, but connection. This was more than fooling around, more than some midnight escape from loneliness. At some point, we ended up tangled together on those blankets, both of us half asleep, whispering in the dark. I traced circles on his chest, and he ran his fingers through my hair, pausing like he didn't want to admit how much he liked it. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" He exhaled, slow and thoughtful, I guess I didn't think past tonight. Figured maybe you'd leave, and I'd pretend this never happened. And now? He turned his head toward me, eyes searching mine. Now I'm kinda hoping you stay a while. I smiled. I was already planning on it. Outside, the breeze picked up, making the old barn creak and groan. Inside, though, everything was still. Peaceful. His arm was warm around my waist, his breath steady against my neck. I'd never felt safer in a stranger's arms, except Cade didn't feel like a stranger anymore. We didn't talk much after that, just shifted against each other, letting the warmth do the work. Eventually, we both dozed off, the weight of the night finally catching up to us. I woke up first, a few hours later, to the sound of birds just starting to chirp. Dawn was breaking, casting pale orange light across the barn floor. Cade was still asleep, his face buried in the crook of my neck, one leg draped over mine like he was afraid I might leave if he let go. I didn't move. I didn't want to. I just laid there, wondering how a drink and a simple invitation turned into this, whatever this was. Complicated, unexpected. And maybe the beginning of something I hadn't realized I needed until that night. And I knew, even if it got messy later, I wouldn't trade this for anything. I must have dozed off again, because the next time I opened my eyes, the barn was bright with morning light. Cade was gone. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The whiskey, the kiss, the barn floor. But then I sat up and felt the dull ache in my back from sleeping on blankets meant for horses, and I spotted my shirt draped over a hay bale. Reality settled in fast. I pulled on my clothes slowly, half expecting Cade to walk back in with 2 cups of coffee and that slow smile of his. But the barn stayed quiet, the only sound the soft shuffling of chickens somewhere outside. I found him out by the fence, shirtless again, this time in worn jeans and boots, a pitchfork in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He was watching the horses, but his shoulders tensed when he heard my footsteps behind him. "Hey," I said, voice rough from sleep. He didn't turn around. "Mornin'." There was a long pause. "You okay?" I asked, coming up beside him. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the pasture. "Yeah, just thinking." "About last night?" He finally looked at me. His eyes were soft, but there was a storm behind them. "Yeah." I waited, giving him space. He ran a hand through his hair, then took a long drag from his cigarette. "I don't regret it, if that's what you're wondering. Just not used to waking up next to someone and not feeling like I've made a mistake." That made my chest ache in a weird way. "You didn't make a mistake." "I know," he said, almost to himself. "Just figuring out what the hell this means." I nodded. "You don't have to figure it all out right now." He finally smiled. Small, tight, but real. "You're not freaking out?" I shrugged. "I've done the whole self-denial dance before. I've watched guys pretend nothing happened. Doesn't scare me." He studied me for a moment. "I don't want to pretend. Not with you." That hit me harder than I expected. I didn't say anything, just reached out and laced my fingers through his. His grip tightened. We stood like that for a while, leaning against the fence, side by side in the morning sun. There wasn't some big plan or dramatic confession. Just 2 guys trying to figure out what came next. Eventually, he said, "I got eggs, coffee, maybe some leftover brisket if you're hungry." I grinned. "You always feed your one-night guests?" He glanced sideways at me. "You think this is a one-night thing? I don't want it to be." His thumb brushed over mine. "Then stay." I did. We ate breakfast in the kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes. The dog kept nudging my leg under the table, like we were already part of his routine. Cade didn't say much, but he kept looking at me like he was trying to memorize every part of the morning. And I couldn't stop stealing glances either, how his hair stuck up in the back, how he kept refilling my coffee before I asked. After we ate, we sat on the porch again, just like the night before, but everything felt different. Lighter, calmer, like something had shifted inside both of us. "Gotta head into town later," he said. "Run errands, pick up feed. Mind if I tag along?" He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Nah, I'd like that." I knew this thing, whatever it was between us, wasn't going to be simple. We were 2 very different people, from two very different worlds. But as he reached for my hand again and squeezed it softly, I started to believe it could be something. And that was enough for now. If I thought things felt intense in the barn, nothing prepared me for how tense Cade became once we got to town. We took his old pickup, faded red, bench seat, smelled like pine and dirt. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting between us, his thumb occasionally brushing against my leg like he forgot and remembered all at once. I didn't mind. I actually liked it, but as soon as the first familiar face waved at him from the sidewalk, an older woman loading groceries into the back of her SUV, he straightened up, both hands on the wheel, eyes locked forward. "You good?" I asked quietly. "Yeah," he said, "just small town." It didn't take a genius to figure out what he meant. The first stop was the feed store. He introduced me as a buddy from out of town, and I didn't push it. We were barely through the doors before two older guys in denim caps turned to greet him. "Cade, you're up early," one of them said. "Livin' the dream," he muttered with a practiced smile. I hung back while he talked shop, watching the way he dropped into a version of himself that I hadn't seen before. Polite, reserved, guarded. He didn't look my way once. I was suddenly very aware of how out of place I looked. Not in a bad way, just obvious. Once we were back in the truck, Cade let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it since we stepped inside. "You don't have to pretend," I said gently. "I'm not pretending. You introduced me like I'm some dude crashing on your couch." He didn't respond at first, just drove. A few minutes passed before he finally said, "I've never brought anyone around before, not like this." I nodded. "I get it. I ain't ashamed of you. Just scared of what comes next." That hit me. Hard. I looked over at him, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the road. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just being honest. "I'm not asking you to put a label on us," I said. "I'm just asking you not to erase what we shared last night." He nodded slowly. "I won't." We didn't talk much the rest of the drive. Not out of anger, just space, letting the silence work. By the time we got back to the ranch, the sun was high overhead, and the heat clung to everything. Cade unloaded the feed, letting the dog run circles around his boots, and I leaned against the porch, unsure if I should head out or wait to be asked to stay. Then he looked up at me and said, "Come on, I want to show you something." I followed him around the side of the house, past a thicket of cedar trees, down a narrow trail that opened into a wide, empty pasture. The grass was high, golden in the afternoon sun. There was an old bench under a single tree at the far end, weathered gray and half covered in moss. "My mom used to sit here every evening," he said quietly, "before she passed. Said it was the only place where she could actually breathe." We sat down, and Cade's hand found mine again. No one around, no one to see. He exhaled and said, "I've been thinking about you since the second I met you." I turned to him. "So why now?" "Because you didn't treat me like I was broken. You didn't push." "Neither did you," I said. He smiled, the first real one since we'd gotten back from town. "I don't know what happens next," he said, squeezing my hand, "but I want it to be with you." I leaned my head against his shoulder, and for the first time all day, I felt something settle inside me. Not certainty exactly, but hope. The kind that maybe, just maybe, grows roots out here in the quiet. We sat under that tree until the sun dipped low behind the hills, turning the sky a soft lavender. Neither of us said much after that. Sometimes silence says everything. Just the weight of his hand in mine, the warmth of his shoulder pressed against me, the occasional sound of wind in the tall grass. It was more intimacy than anything we'd said out loud so far. Eventually, Cade stood up, stretching. "Come on, I'll make us dinner." Back at the house, he moved around the kitchen with quiet ease, like muscle memory. I offered to help, but he waved me off, insisting I sit. So I did, watching him slice onions, salt meat, and fire up the old stovetop grill. There was something oddly calming about it. It reminded me of Sundays with my mom, back when I was still figuring myself out, when comfort came from quiet routines and not having to explain who I was. He handed me a plate stacked with grilled steak, potatoes, and sautéed greens. We ate on the porch, barefoot, plates balanced on our knees, the dog curled up by my feet. Halfway through his meal, Cade said, "I should have told you sooner I was into guys." I looked at him. "You didn't owe me anything. You still don't." "I know," he said, "but I owe myself something. I've been lying to myself a long time." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. "My dad, he was old school. Hell of a man, but not the kind you talked feelings with. Always figured I'd get married, take over the ranch, have kids. But deep down, I knew since high school." "What stopped you?" He gave me a tired smile. "Fear. Same thing that stops most folks." I nodded. "Well, you're not hiding now." Cade set his plate down and turned to face me fully. "I don't want to hide anymore." Something shifted in that moment, not just in him, but in how I saw him. This wasn't just a cowboy figuring himself out. This was someone making a choice to live differently. And I realized I was witnessing his first real step into something new. He leaned in, his hand brushing mine. "I want to try, if you'll let me. You and me." I blinked. "You sure?" he chuckled. "No, but I've never been more willing to find out." It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no fireworks, no sweeping declarations. Just two men on a porch, full from dinner, legs touching in the warm evening air, making a promise that neither of us said out loud, but both of us understood. Later, we sat in his bed, the sheets warm from our bodies, his head resting against my chest. The fan whirred quietly above us, and outside crickets chirped their endless rhythm. "I don't know how to do this," he said softly, fingers tracing patterns across my stomach. "Me neither," I whispered. "We'll figure it out." And in that dark room, wrapped in Cade's arms, I believed it. We'd figure it out. I woke in the middle of the night to Cade's fingers brushing across my back. Slow, absent-minded, almost like he didn't know he was doing it. "You awake?" he murmured. "Yeah," I whispered, eyes still closed. He shifted beside me, closer, his arm draping across my waist like he was scared I might drift away if he didn't keep a part of me under his hand. "I've never felt this calm before," he said, voice thick with sleep. "It's weird." "It's not weird," I said. "It's what happens when you stop lying to yourself." He didn't say anything to that, just pulled me in tighter. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds our breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling in the wind. I thought maybe he'd fallen back asleep until he spoke again, softer this time. "You think people will talk if they see us together?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because we both already did. Small towns don't miss much, and two guys having dinner together or walking through the feed store side by side, people notice. They talk. "They might," I finally said, "but they've probably already been talking." Cade let out a tired laugh. "You say that like it doesn't bother you." I rolled onto my side, facing him. "It used to. It doesn't now. I stopped letting strangers decide what kind of life I get to have." He looked at me in the dark. "I want to be that brave." "You already are." The next morning, Cade made pancakes, terrible ones, burned on the edges and undercooked in the middle, but he insisted on doing it himself. Said it was about earning breakfast the hard way. While we ate, he said, "I told my friend Mason to stop by later. Figured I'd introduce you." I nearly dropped my fork. "Wait, introduce me?" He nodded, chewing. "Yeah, not like my boyfriend or anything, unless you want that. But I want you to meet someone who's known me since forever. I'm tired of acting like I'm alone out here." Something flickered in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was nerves or something deeper, something I hadn't let myself feel in a while. "I'd like that," I said quietly. Later, when Mason pulled up in a beat-up truck, Cade didn't flinch. He met him out front like he always did, waved me over without hesitation, and said, "This is the guy the first was telling you about. He's staying with me for a while." Mason gave me a long look, then smiled and stuck out his hand. About time Cade had some decent company. We shook hands. Cade glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, just long enough for our fingers to brush for a second too long as we walked back toward the porch. It was subtle, but it was a start. That night, as we stood watching the stars again, Cade wrapped his arm around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. The sky was clear, and the air smelled like cedar and smoke. "You ever think you'd fall for a cowboy?" he asked. "Only every time I watched Brokeback Mountain, I deadpanned." He laughed. "Guess I should have worn a hat." "You're fine just like this." And I meant it. I didn't know what the future looked like for us, not really, but I knew I wanted to find out. 2 weeks passed. Not all of it was perfect. Cade had his moments. Times he went quiet or seemed to disappear into his own head. He still flinched a little when we walked too close in town, still tensed when someone looked at us too long. But each day, those moments came less often. We built routines, mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent fixing up the barn or driving into town to pick up supplies. Evenings tangled up in his sheets or stretched across the old leather couch, watching reruns and half paying attention. He started touching me more in public, not full-on PDA, but small things. A hand on my lower back when we crossed a street. A brush of his fingers across mine while we waited in line. And the first time he introduced me to someone as someone I care about, I nearly forgot how to breathe. One afternoon, we were fixing a busted gate post when Cade stopped, leaned on his shovel, and said, "You ever think about staying?" It hit me sideways, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I didn't think he had. "You mean staying here?" I asked. He nodded, real slow. "I know it ain't much, but you fit here. At least with me." I stepped closer, wiping sweat from my brow. "You sure?" He grinned. "Nope. But if I waited to be sure about everything, I'd never do a damn thing." That night, we took the horses out to the edge of the property, to the highest hill overlooking miles of pasture and pine. The stars were already out, and the breeze was soft, carrying the sounds of night across the open land. We sat side by side, legs brushing, shoulders touching. "I used to come out here when I was a kid," Cade said, "and wonder what kind of life I'd have. Never pictured this." "You sound like that's a bad thing." He shook his head. "Nah. It's better than I imagined." We were quiet for a long time after that. Just the wind, the dark, the occasional rustle of horses behind us. "I'm not going to ask you to stay forever," he said, barely above a whisper. "But if you did, I wouldn't hate it." I turned to him. "I think I already made up my mind." The next morning, I started looking for long-term rentals nearby. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moving truck or tearful goodbye to my city life. Just small decisions, one day at a time. A toothbrush left on his sink. My laptop set up at his kitchen table. A drawer with my clothes. A shared bed, most nights. Cade still wasn't out to everyone, and he didn't need to be. But he stopped hiding from himself. From us. He kissed me outside the feed store one morning. Quick, a little clumsy. But he didn't look around after. He didn't apologize. It was the first time I saw him look proud. I never expected to fall in love out there, in the middle of nowhere. Never expected some quiet, whiskey-drinking cowboy to flip my whole world upside down, with a look, a laugh, a barn full of silence. But I'm glad he did. Because some stories aren't about fireworks or drama. Some are just about being seen, being chosen, being known. And that's exactly what he gave me.